Have you ever had a massive argument with a family member over something that, looking back, seems kind of small? But then you realize it wasn't just about that one thing. It was about years of little disagreements, different ways of seeing the world, and a whole lot of pride. Well, that's a pretty good way to think about one of the biggest family feuds in history, the Great Schism of 1054. This was the moment when the Christian Church, which had been one big family for 1,000 years, officially split into two. In the West, you got the Roman Catholic Church, led by the Pope in Rome. In the East, the Eastern Orthodox Church, led by the Patriarch of Constantinople. They haven't fully made up since. So, what happened? What could possibly be so serious that it would tear apart the world's largest religion? It's a story of power, politics, language, and even the bread you eat for communion. To really get it, we need to rewind the clock way before 1054. The Roman Empire was huge, stretching from Britain to the Middle East. It was so big that in the late 3rd century, Emperor Diocletian decided it was impossible to manage from one city. So he split it into two halves for administrative purposes: the Western Roman Empire with its capital in Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire with its capital in a city that would later be named Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. This political split was the first crack in the foundation. Over time, these two halves of the empire grew apart. In the West, Latin was the language of the government and the church. In the East, it was Greek. This language barrier wasn't just about translation. It created two different worlds of thought and theology. They were reading different books, debating different ideas, and developing unique traditions. It was like two siblings growing up in separate houses, speaking different languages. They might share the same parents, but their daily lives and perspectives would become wildly different. One of the biggest, and I mean biggest, points of contention was the Bishop of Rome, or as we know him, the Pope. From the very beginning, the Bishop of Rome held a special position. He was seen as the successor to St. Peter, who Jesus famously called the rock on which he would build his church. The Western Church, based in Rome, interpreted this to mean that the Pope had supreme authority over all other bishops and the entire church. This idea is called papal primacy. The East had a very different view. They respected the Pope and saw him as the first among equals. They believed all major bishops, or patriarchs, of important cities like Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem were collectively in charge. For them, the church was more like a council or a committee, not a monarchy with the Pope as the absolute king. The Eastern bishops were willing to give the Pope the seat of honor at the family dinner table, but they weren't about to let him dictate what everyone else had to eat. As the centuries rolled on, the popes in Rome began to assert their authority more forcefully, and the Eastern patriarchs began to push back more strongly. This was a power struggle, plain and simple. Then came the theological debates. These might seem really abstract to us now, but back then they were a huge deal. The most famous one is the filioque clause. Don't worry about the Latin word. What it means is the important part. The original Nicene Creed, a foundational statement of Christian belief, agreed upon by the whole Church in the 4th century, said that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. Simple enough. However, sometime around the 6th century, churches in the West, starting in Spain, began adding a little phrase. They started saying the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father asterisk and the Son asterisk. And the Son in Latin is filioque. The Western Church argued this addition clarified the relationship between the members of the Trinity and helped combat certain heresies. But for the Eastern Church, this was a disaster. First, they saw it as a violation of the universal agreement. How could one part of the Church unilaterally change a creed that was decided by everyone? It was like one co-author adding a new chapter to a book without telling the other. Second, They disagreed with the theology of it. They believed it diminished the unique role of the Father within the Trinity. This one little word, filioque, became a massive symbol of everything that was going wrong. To the East, it represented Rome's arrogance and its willingness to go its own way without consulting anyone. But it wasn't just high-level theology and power politics. There were also cultural and practical differences that drove a wedge between East and West. Think of them as different family traditions. For example, in the West, priests were required to be celibate and couldn't marry. In the East, priests were allowed to be married. That's a pretty big lifestyle difference. Then there was the bread used in the Eucharist, or Holy Communion. The Western Church used unleavened bread, like a flat wafer, to commemorate the Passover meal during the Last Supper. The Eastern Church used leavened bread, which rises to symbolize the risen Christ. This might seem like a minor detail about baking, but it became a point of major conflict. Each side accused the other of not performing the sacrament correctly. There were also differences in fasting rules, the way priests shaved or grew their beards. The Eastern clergy had beards. The Roman clergy were clean-shaven. Each of these little things on its own wasn't a deal-breaker. But when you add them all up, they painted a picture of two distinct cultures that were drifting further and further apart. So, all this tension had been bubbling for centuries. There were temporary splits and reconciliations, angry letters flying back and forth between Rome and Constantinople. The final break came in 1054. The Pope at the time, Leo IX, sent a delegation to Constantinople led by a fiery cardinal named Humbert. He was not a diplomat. His mission was to demand that the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, acknowledge the Pope's supreme authority and accept Western practices, like the filioque clause. Cerularius, who was just as stubborn and proud as Humbert, refused. The negotiations, if you can even call them that, collapsed spectacularly. On July 16, 1054, Cardinal Humbert marched into the Hagia Sophia, the most magnificent church in Constantinople, right in the middle of a service. He walked up to the main altar and slammed down a papal bull, a formal decree that excommunicated Patriarch Cerularius and his followers. He basically declared them kicked out of the church. Cerularius wasn't one to take an insult lying down. A few days later, he held his own council and excommunicated Cardinal Humbert and the papal delegation in return. And that was it. The mutual excommunications were the final, dramatic act that sealed the Great Schism. The two sides of the Christian family had officially disowned each other. For a long time, many people probably thought this was just another temporary spat that would eventually be patched up. But it wasn't. The centuries that followed only made the division deeper. The biggest blow came in 1204, during the Fourth Crusade. Western knights, who were originally supposed to be heading to the Holy Land to fight, got diverted and ended up brutally sacking the Christian city of Constantinople. They looted its churches, destroyed priceless art, and desecrated its holy sites. For the Eastern Orthodox, this was the ultimate betrayal. How could their fellow Christians do this to them? Any hope of reconciliation was shattered. This act of violence left a deep and painful scar that for many has never fully healed. It cemented the idea in the East that the Western, or Latin, Christians were untrustworthy aggressors. So, the Great Schism wasn't a single event, but the culmination of 1,000 years of drifting apart. It was a perfect storm of political rivalry between Rome and Constantinople, a clash of personalities between powerful popes and patriarchs, a language barrier that created two separate intellectual worlds and different cultural practices that made each side feel alien to the other. In recent decades, there have been major efforts to bridge this divide. In 1965, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras formally lifted the mutual excommunications of 1054. It was a hugely symbolic and hopeful moment. But 1,000 years of separate history can't be erased overnight. The Catholic and Orthodox churches are now in dialogue. They see each other as sister churches. But major theological differences, especially concerning the role of the Pope, remain. The story of the Great Schism is a powerful reminder of how differences in culture, power, and pride can tear even the strongest bonds apart. It's a family feud written on the grandest scale of history. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey through history interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments what other historical splits you'd like to learn about. See you next time.